Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here. I think this is maybe the fourth or fifth year in a row I've had the honor to speak here. And it's true my siblings are good looking, but I got the brains, at least some of them. So as Mark pointed out, I do spend a lot of time thinking about nuclear weapons. I'm current, and so we can talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. But I thought for my presentation I would provide a broader perspective, thinking about U.S. foreign policy, really over the past 70 years. As Mark mentioned, like I think all of you, I'm a Christian, and for much of my early career, these parts of my lives were separate. I had my religious life, I had my professional life, but in part thanks to Mark and the opportunity to participate in venues like this, I have been thinking more and more about how they interrelate. You might think there are some tensions, but I've come to realize that actually I think by supporting U.S. foreign policy and engaged America, we are doing good in the world, and I'm working on a book now titled Force for Good: How American Power Makes the World Safer, Richer, and Freer. And I do believe that the United States has been the greatest force for good in the world over the past 70 years, and that's what I want to talk about today. You sometimes have people say, well, does the United States really have a strategy in the world, or because of our democracy, is it just focused on what's going to happen in the next election cycle? We're focused on November. We're not thinking long term. We're too polarized to have a coherent strategy. We get in the Iran deal, we get out. You hear people say, well, China has a plan for 2049. We can't think past the next election cycle. But in this book, I argue that actually, I think the United States has had a fairly consistent grand strategy since World War II. And sometimes I think these debates of differences between administration are the narcissism of small differences. But taking a step back, there is a way the United States has approached the world over the past 70 years that is unique and is different from how, say, Chinese Communist Party, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union would have tried to structure the world. And so essentially it's a three-part grand strategy, and I want to walk through each of the three parts and talk about the results. But first is creating a lot of different names. We could debate the names probably for the next hour, but a rules-based international system. Is it a rules-based system, a liberal system, a U.S.-led system? But basically creating this post-World War II international system. Second, inviting other countries to join that system. And then third, defending the system from challengers, those who would try to disrupt it or tear it down. So step one, building a rules-based international system. We're basically still living in the world that the United States and its democratic allies created after World War II. So after World War II, look back on the previous half century, realize that didn't go very well. What kind of system do we want to construct? And so they did a number of things. One, they created strong alliances. The United States created strong alliances in Europe and Asia, two regions of the world that caused World War II and that had seen warfare for centuries before. So created strong alliances in Europe and Asia to keep the peace in these important geopolitical regions. Also developed informal security arrangements in other parts of the world. No formal allies in the Middle East. People are sometimes surprised to hear that. Israel is not a formal ally, but strong security partnerships with Israel, other countries in the Middle East. So by creating these strong alliances, trying to secure the most important geopolitical regions on Earth. Continuing in the security realm, the United States and its allies set up systems to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction. So the United States was the lead architect of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and has worked hard to stop the spread of nuclear weapons to both friends and to enemies. So we see the efforts now with Iran and North Korea, sanctions, threats of force to stop our enemies. But the United States also goes to great lengths to stop our friends from building nuclear weapons. One of the things we do is extend our nuclear deterrent and say, don't build your own nuclear weapons. You can rely on American nuclear weapons. Also, the United States has used its power to secure the so-called global commons, to make sure that the seas, airspace, cyberspace, outer space are safe for commerce, for travel. And we kind of take that for granted because we've had it for 70 years, but look back before 1945, the high seas weren't always safe for international trade. You'd have to worry about pirates or enemy boats sinking your ships. So the United States and its allies have worked hard to make the world safer over the past 70 years. And what's been the result? So 0 great power wars for 70 years, pretty remarkable. We saw great power wars in every stage of history until 1945. Since 1945, 0 great power wars. A number of people who die in armed conflict. From the 1600s until 1945, 1 to 2% of the world's population could expect to die in armed conflict. Now the number is less than 0.01%, so a drastic reduction. Some international relations scholars would say, well, it's just nuclear deterrence. Everybody's been too afraid to fight because of nuclear weapons. I think that's partly true, but I don't think it's North Korean or Soviet nuclear weapons that have been keeping the world safe. It's been American nuclear weapons, extending deterrence to over 30 formal treaty allies now. 60% of global GDP in the 30 democratic countries are protected by U.S. Nuclear weapons. So I think without a powerful and engaged United States, very unlikely we would have experienced this really remarkable peace over the past 70 years. What about in the economic realm? Well, the United States and its allies after World War II got together and said, well, in the immediate interwar period, we really got things wrong. There was a lot of protectionism, trade wars, high tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the United States. They got together and said, that didn't work. We really want an open international system. We want countries to adopt free markets. We want to have an open economic system, low tariffs, freer trade. And so they set up institutions designed to do that. The Global Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, a number of institutions to promote free markets and global economic interdependence. And then the United States also used other tools. For example, when it provided development aid to countries, they would say, we'll provide you with this aid, but we want some guarantees that it's not just going to be wasted. We want you to see market-based reforms in your countries as a condition for this aid. U.S. allies did some of the same things. European Union said, okay, if you want to join the European Union, you need to make economic reforms. You need to lower your debt and your deficit, meet certain free market standards to become part of our club. What has been the result in the economic domain? And I wish I had some figures behind me. But if you look at levels of global economic interdependence from 1945 to the present, it's really remarkable. A number of ways to measure globalization. One common measure is imports plus exports as a percentage of GDP. So essentially, as a percentage of global wealth, how much of it is due to trade? And what you see going back to the beginning of when we have data up until 1945, it's basically flat and low. A little bit of an increase right before World War I comes crashing back down. And then after World War II, straight up. And then again, after 1991, up even further as the countries that had been behind in the Warsaw Pact, behind the Iron Curtain, joined the free world, adopted market economies. During the same time, a lot of economic theory that globalization contributes overall to improved standards of living. And so you see the same thing in the numbers. 1945, 66% of the world's population lived in poverty. Now it's 10%. So still too high, but billions of people lifted out of poverty over the past 70 years. Global GDP, the average per capita, average standard of living, roughly 5 times higher today than it was in 1945. So the world is much wealthier today than it was before this era of U.S. Leadership. Now, what are other explanations for this? Well, some economists would say, well, it's technology, it's globalization, it's the internet, it's cheap air travel. And I think there's something to that, but where was the airplane invented? Where was the internet invented? I think this was also the result of American ingenuity. And still, these are political choices. We do see countries like North Korea who decide to cut themselves off from this globalized world, but it has been the United States and its allies encouraging countries to liberalize their economies. That has led to political decisions that, again, it's not just the internet. Finally, what about democracy and human rights? The United States and its allies have also worked to promote democracy and human rights around the world since 1945. And it's done that in a number of ways. The most obvious way was occupation after World War II. We occupied Western Europe, our forces occupied Germany, helped them to establish new democratic forms of government. Decolonization. We put a lot of pressure on our allies after World War II to give up their overseas empires. So India got independence, for example, as a new democratic country, but many others. We also used conditionality when it came to democracy and human rights. We said, okay, you can join NATO if you want, but you have to become a democracy. Part of the reason that Ukraine didn't get in before the war, but was a huge encouragement to Hungary, Czech Republic, other countries to adopt democratic forms of government after the end of the Cold War. And then the United States is also led by example, and I think, again, the end of the Cold War is the best evidence for this. During the Cold War, you had a lot of countries around the world adopting communist forms of government, single-party rule. After the end of the Cold War, many of those countries adopted democratic forms of government, mimicking the United States. And so what has been the effect of U.S. influence there? Well, we often forget before World War II, there were only a handful of democracies on Earth. A handful in Europe, in Asia, only Australia. Now, there are roughly 100 democratic countries on Earth. So the world is much freer today than it was before the beginning of this U.S. Era. So I think it's very hard to understand the great improvement in the human condition over the past 70 years without taking into account a powerful and engaged United States promoting security, free markets, and democracy and human rights. So that's kind of pillar one, setting up this system. Pillar two is inviting other countries to join the system. It's anybody can join, any country. If you want to, not build nuclear weapons, not support terrorism, not threaten your neighbors, adopt a market-based economy, become democratic and human, and respect human rights, welcome to the club. So Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were enemies during World War II. Within a couple of years, we said, welcome, you're allies, build the system with us. Same thing after the end of the Cold War. We were pointing nuclear weapons at Warsaw Pact countries. A few years later, we were welcoming them to the club. Join NATO, join the EU, welcome. So I often get questions about U.S.-Iran relations, and people say, well, why do Americans hate Iranians so much? Does it go back to the hostage crisis in the 1970s? And I say, no, I think it's Iran's behavior. It's that they build nuclear weapons, build missiles, support terrorism, commit egregious human rights violations. I've said, and I think correctly, that if Iran today said, great news, we're giving up our nuclear program, we're giving up our missile program, we're no longer going to support terrorism, we're going to hold free and fair elections, that there would be bipartisan celebrations in Washington, and we'd say the same thing we said to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan after their transformations. We'd say, welcome to the club. Happy to have you. Third part of the strategy, though, is defending the system from those who would try to tear it down. During the Cold War, the big one, of course, was the Soviet Union. So this grand strategy was organized about defending the system from the Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, the threat came from rogue states, basically regional autocratic powers that felt threatened by the system for a variety of reasons. built nuclear weapons and missiles to challenge the United States, and terrorist organizations. And so that was the focus of U.S. national security strategy in the 90s, the 2000s, to some degree the 2010s. But now the biggest challenge to the system comes from China and to a lesser degree from Putin and Russia. And so these are now the big priorities in U.S. national security strategy, trying to defend this system that our allies and we built over the past 70 years from Russia, which is trying to disrupt the system, trying to play a spoiler role, and China, which I think really wants to displace this system and set up a kind of Chinese-led system that I think would be very different in all of those various ways. It's an interesting thought experiment because I think some people may be not used to thinking of the world this way, but imagine if Nazi Germany had won World War II, would the world look the way that it does today? Imagine the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, would the world look the way that it does today? Imagine that China overtakes the United States, becomes the world's leading power, has the ability to reshape the international system to its preferences. Would it look the same way that it does today? And I think the answer is clearly no, that the world we're living in is a world that was shaped by constitutional democracies to fit the way that we think the world should be ordered, that works for us. And the results have been remarkable. So I think I'll end my remarks there and very much look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Nathan Moyes, LaTourneau University. So I have two questions, a fun one and a serious one. So the fun one, how do you feel about the Pentomic Army as it relates to drones today? And the second question, the more serious one, is just about defending the system, considering there's a lot of non-conventional or non-state threats like terrorists and hacktivists. How should we address those type of threats?
Yeah, and I think I missed a key word in your first question. You said Pentomic Army?
Yes, the strategy from the 60s. I think General MacArthur advocated it. So.
Yeah, so good. So first on drones, it is changing the nature of warfare. I think looking into the future, we can imagine militaries that have very few manned systems anymore. The United States has always had pilots and aircraft flying the airplanes, sailors and ships and submarines. But I think drivers and tanks. It won't be too far into the future where I think a lot of those systems are unmanned. And you do have a lot of military experts who say, why does the United States even continue to build manned platforms? That's old way of doing things. So there will be big implications for that, I think, both positive and negative. On the positive side, you're risking fewer American military personnel if they're not there. On the other hand, some people worry, does that make it easier for leaders to go to war if essentially it's going to be our robots fighting the enemy's robots? Does it seem like an easier, cost-free decision? Going back and putting it in a broader historical context, and I'm a political science professor, my last book started with the Greeks and the Persians 2,500 years ago and came to the present. But military historians say we've seen various revolutions in military affairs that have fundamentally changed international politics and warfare. So there's the gunpowder revolution in the 1600s is the big one, the nuclear revolution in the 1940s. Many people, including me, suspect we may be on the eve of a new revolution in military affairs. There are just so many new technologies coming online at the same time. Unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, quantum computing, additive manufacturing to produce weapon systems. And so we can't quite see it yet, but I think we may be on the verge of a country figuring out how do we put together all these new technologies for a new way of warfare. And we may be seeing indications of it on the battlefield in Ukraine right now. Pretty remarkable the way drones are being utilized by both sides. And the second question, terrorism. So terrorism is a challenge. If I was giving this lecture 15 years ago, it probably would have been the primary focus. I actually started graduate school August 2001. I thought I was going to focus on European political economy. I thought it'd be a good excuse to go to Italy and eat good food. And then September 11th happened a few weeks into my graduate training, and so I reoriented to focus on national security strategy. That's the reason I'm in this field. After bin Laden was killed, many people said, oh, well, the war on terror is over. It was really about al-Qaeda. Bin Laden was the leader. Now he's dead. We don't have to worry about terrorism anymore. I was on the other side of that debate saying, no, this is still an attractive tactic for radical groups. And the ideology continues to exist. The strategic motivation continues to exist. And unfortunately, I was correct. We saw the rise of ISIS just a couple of years later. Now ISIS and al-Qaeda are both on the back foot. It has been a difficult operational environment for them over the past 20 years because of the U.S.-led war on terror. I think there are some people who say, the past 20 years was a mistake. That period of history is over. Let's focus on China. I guess I still think that the ideology continues to exist. The strategic motivations continue to exist. And all it takes, God forbid, would be an attack on Washington, tomorrow, on New York tomorrow, and terrorism would once again be at the top of the national security agenda. So I think it continues to be a challenge and something that we need to take seriously. So, other questions?
Nathaniel Kroenig, Regent University. Basically just wondering, so regarding the European Union, I know it's kind of like a realist principle and whatnot, kind of to consider both your friends and your rivals and whatnot. And so essentially, is them like gaining more power and whatnot and economic influence especially something that the United States should eventually become wary of? Or is that something that we should definitely allow and be welcoming to?
Yeah, so I think and I mentioned my last book. So in 2020, I published a book on democracies versus autocracies and great power rivalry, starting with the Greeks against the Persians up through the U.S. and China. And so I think this is one of America's greatest strengths, that other people, other countries like us, they want to be our friends. They're afraid of Xi, they're afraid of Putin. And that's been a strength of democracies over the millennia. We tend to be better at building friendships and partnerships. So I think this is basically an asset. If you look at the U.S.-China competition, one way IR scholars measure power is GDP. The U.S. has about 23% of global GDP. A little bit of an aside, people sometimes say the United States is declining. That's not true. The United States has had between 20 and 25% of global GDP since the 1960s. We're at 23% today. It's where we've been for the past half century. What has changed, though, is that China is rising. So 20 years ago, China was 2% of global GDP. 10 years ago, it was 9% of global GDP. Now it's 16% of global GDP, so it's closing that gap. Reason to believe that China is leveling off or declining. We can talk about that if you're interested. But to the main point, if it's the U.S. against China, it's 23% of global GDP against 16%, a little bit too close for comfort. If you add in the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Australia, other democratic allies on our side, we're close to 60% of global GDP. So working with friends and allies, we do have a preponderance of power to decisively shape global outcomes. So I think it's an asset, but not that it's easy. They have their own interests, so trying to get them on the same page has been a challenge. It's been remarkable. 3 or 4 years ago, talking to Europeans about China, they essentially said, "What's the problem? Everybody's getting rich. We want to sell them BMWs." They've really come a long way in the past few years, and we're closer to having a common assessment on China. They're not quite where we'd want them to be, but they're closer. And then the other piece is burden sharing. So yes, we want to work with our allies, but they also have to chip in and do their fair share. And this has been a common complaint going all the way back to Eisenhower. Secretary Gates in the Obama administration made his last major speech a trip to Europe, complaining that Europeans weren't doing enough for their defense. Of course, Trump made this a major issue. Fortunately, the war in Ukraine is tragic. One upside has been that it has woken Europeans up to the need to that security is a real thing. Major war is possible in the 21st century. So we have seen big announcements from the Germans, the Poles, the Romanians, and others to increase their defense spending. Finland and Sweden, two capable countries, deciding to join NATO. So I think there's some movements in the right direction, but still more work to be done, because the biggest defense challenge I think the United States and its allies face is that we have to be able to deal with Russia and China at the same time. Admiral Richards, head of U.S. Strategic Commands, has said for the first time in U.S. history, we have to deal with two near-peer nuclear powers. Russia's conventional military is getting chewed up, but it still has enough nuclear weapons to end this meeting in 30 minutes. China is quintupling the size of its nuclear arsenal. And so the United States could deal with both of those challenges on its own, but it would be much, much better if we have our 30 wealthy allies helping us with that challenge.
Sean McGuire from Cairn University. I've heard a lot about Putin's possible use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Can you speak to what those kinds of options look like? The only thing I have in mind is like the traditional bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What kind of options does he have?
Yeah, this is an issue I've worked a lot on, and probably gotten more media attention on this question in the past month than in the rest of my life. I've been quoted in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, BBC, everywhere in the past month on this. A couple of points. One, I think Putin hasn't made up his own mind yet as to whether to use nuclear weapons. On one hand, I think he sees it as attractive. Because it's basically Russian strategy. They realized if they got into a major war with NATO that they had conventional inferiority. And so their plan to defeat NATO was to rely early on nuclear weapons. Nuclear threats first, to try to get NATO to back down, but as a last resort, using nuclear weapons to beat NATO's conventional forces. And so it's part of their strategy. They exercise for this. Putin has participated in televised exercises where he launches a nuclear attack. It tells you something about how Russian culture around nuclear weapons is very different. Can you imagine Biden going on national TV, proudly executing a simulated nuclear attack? Kind of hard to imagine, but that's what Putin does. And then they've built a force for this. 2,000 so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons. So the Russians have nuclear-armed torpedoes to go after ships, nuclear-armed depth charges to go after submarines, nuclear-armed surface-to-air missiles to nuke airplanes, nuclear-armed missile defense interceptors to nuke incoming missiles, nuclear short-range missiles, nuclear bombs. Basically, any weapon system you can imagine, the Russians put a nuke on it. So they have a wide variety of weapons to choose from to conduct an attack, and varying yields. So some very large yield weapons, but they're believed to have some weapons that may be sub-kiloton. So Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. Sub-kiloton would mean less than 1/15 of Hiroshima. So a weapon like that, you use it here, and Georgetown would basically be fine. So it would have a devastating local effect if you use it on a military base or something, completely destroy the base with one weapon instead of a bunch of conventional weapons. But you limit the fallout, you limit the damage. So what Russia could do is, one, I think they're already using nuclear weapons. They're using the threat of nuclear weapons to deter the United States successfully. The Biden administration is carefully calibrating its involvement because they fear nuclear escalation. But as the next step, Putin could use a single nuclear weapon, maybe a nuclear test, maybe against a Ukrainian base, and in the hope that the rest of the world would back down, and he might be right in that hope. How would the Western Europeans react? How would the Biden administration react if a nuclear weapon has just been used in Ukraine? Maybe they would say, okay, this has gone too far. We're not going to fight a nuclear war over this. But then finally, as the next step, you don't build 2,000 of these battlefield nuclear weapons to use one. So they could use 5, 10, 100 against Ukrainian tanks, Ukrainian bases, Ukrainian supply lines to win the war, or at least avoid losing the war. So on one hand, I think Putin would like to do that. On the other, but why hasn't he done it yet? He made these threats in February. It's almost November. Why hasn't he done it? I think he has been deterred. So I don't think it's out of the goodness of his heart. I don't think he thinks, oh, this would be inappropriate. He's committing war crimes, invading his neighbors. I think he's afraid of the consequences. And I think he is afraid that who knows what would happen. Maybe this would lead to a big war with the United States. Maybe this would lead to a big war with NATO. So I think he hasn't decided. He's on the fence. On one hand, this could help him avoid losing in Ukraine. On the other hand, maybe he gets into a big war with NATO that's even worse. So I think the best thing that we can do is to play on his fears. And the Biden administration's rhetoric hasn't always been great on this. John Kirby, a National Security Council spokesman, about a month ago said, if Russia uses nuclear weapons, there'd be catastrophic consequences. And I said, okay, that's good. And he said, for example, the radioactive material could blow back into Russia. And I thought, I don't, Putin's perfectly willing to kill a lot of Russians. I don't think he cares if some people on the border get radiation sickness. But then a couple of weeks ago, Jake Sullivan on the Sunday shows, I thought was perfect. He said, there'd be catastrophic consequences for Russia. There'd be a decisive U.S. response. And he left it kind of vague, but I think it was enough for Putin to think, all right, this could get scary. Do I really want a war with NATO or the United States? So I hope that those kind of statements will be enough to deter him. But I think there is a real risk. And when people ask me to put a number on it, I've said I think 20% chance. I think it's not likely, but I think it's not zero. Other questions?
Good afternoon, Chongwon Lee from American University. My question is also on nuclear deterrence. Increasingly facing North Korea's missile provocations, there's a sentiment growing in South Korea and Japan that we can trust U.S. extended deterrence even more if U.S. would make promise to return back U.S. tactical nukes deployed in Japan or South Korea, and a similar nuclear core sharing arrangement the U.S. have with NATO countries. Now, that's popular in South Korea and Japan, but as a U.S. nuclear expert, what is the U.S. take on such propositions? Nuclear core sharing.
Yes. So during the Cold War, the United States used to forward deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of its allies. And so in Europe, having nuclear weapons in Germany made it very clear to the Soviet Union that if you try to conduct a conventional invasion, you're going to be overrunning nuclear weapons, U.S. Forces with nuclear weapons. It's very likely that it would go nuclear. And it was thought that would contribute to deterrence. So we got rid of a lot of our nuclear weapons in Europe, but not all of them. Roughly 200 gravity bombs remain in Europe. And then we also had nuclear weapons forward deployed in Asia, but then after the end of the Cold War, we brought all of those back. So there aren't nuclear weapons today. But the United States does have a formal policy of extending nuclear deterrence to Japan and South Korea. And we engage in close dialogues with those allies. And we've gotten better about and in fact, a new national defense strategy just came out today and said one of the major goals of U.S. defense strategy is to assure our allies. And that's been pretty consistent for many administrations. So there are a number of ways to assure allies. So one of the things we do is bring allies here and show them our nuclear weapons. You want to climb around on a nuclear submarine. It works. We have dialogues. What are the threats we see from North Korea? If North Korea used nuclear weapons, how might we respond? We deploy conventional forces on the territory of our allies. 38,000 U.S. forces in Korea, I think, today. So that's another source of assurance. If you get into a war with North Korea, it's not just you. American forces are going to be involved immediately. So we're doing a lot to assure. And so you're right that some South Koreans, not the South Korean government, but some South Koreans have said, well, maybe the United States should return nuclear weapons. And so my thinking on that is, I don't think it's really necessary for deterrence or for military purposes, because we do have other capabilities, including nuclear weapons on submarines, on long-range bombers, that in some ways would be more helpful for a Korean contingency. But I do think assurance is important. So if there was a South Korean or a Japanese government who said, we're really nervous, all these other efforts you're making, we're not sure if that would work, we really would feel better if you brought nuclear weapons back. I think that's a discussion, conversation the U.S. government should be willing to have, but I don't see any pressing operational need right now.
Time for one more question.
Thomas Foster, national security student at Regent, a lieutenant, United States Navy. I have a question about China. So, has there been any conversation about a Chinese version of the New START Treaty? And given what's happening in Russia, do we even want to pursue something like that, given that clearly a nuclear threat can happen even if we have an agreement? And does that mean that policy, go back to Dr. Patterson's point at the beginning of the day, is there a certain point where policy is not the answer and more hard power deterrence is?
Yeah, so I think there's basically been a bipartisan consensus in U.S. strategic forces policy, and essentially the consensus is strong deterrence and strong arms control. So we need to make sure that we have a nuclear deterrent that can protect ourselves and our allies, deter our enemies, but we should also engage in talks with our adversaries if they're willing to put limits on their nuclear program in a way that we think makes us safer, that we could actually trust and verify that that's also in our interest. And so, essentially the national security, the defense people are okay with arms control talks so long as we have a strong deterrent. And the arms control people are happy with a strong deterrent so long as they can try to talk and find agreements to reduce nuclear risks. So I do think that basically works. We should pursue both paths. Part of the problem, though, on the arms control side right now is China is engaged in this massive nuclear buildup and refuses to even talk about arms control. So the Trump administration tried to negotiate trilateral arms control, tried to get a deal with both Russia and China at the same time. China refused to even come to the table. We do have this New START agreement in place with Russia, but Russia's it doesn't cover all nuclear weapons. So Russia's building nuclear weapons like these 2000 battlefield nuclear weapons I was talking about that aren't covered in the treaty. So essentially you have Russia building up, despite the fact that it's in the treaty, China building up. And so I suspect that when New START ends in 2026, that's when it expires, I suspect for the first time since the 1970s, we won't have arms control agreements in place. It's very hard for me to imagine a new arms control deal that places verifiable limits on Chinese and Russian arsenals. I think we should try. I think we should talk to them. But again, the Chinese refuse to even come to the table. And so going back to this bipartisan, two-track approach, so let's try this. I don't think there's much there. And so, yes, I think we do need to make sure that we have a strong deterrent. And basically, our nuclear forces that we have today were designed in 2010. But the world is very different today, much more dangerous today than in 2010. It's projected to get even more dangerous over the coming decades. So I do think we need to take another look at our strategic forces. Is this really what we need, or do we need to strengthen them for the challenges we face? So, thanks.
Thank you, Matt.